This is the new 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini. There are a lot of improvements, so let's quickly talk about all the new changes that we find in the 2025 edition. Up first, the big thing here is that they've increased the width of the device 2 millimeters on each side. Effectively, it is now 4 millimeters wider. They also have increased the thickness by about 1 millimeter. Now, that isn't all that much. When we compare them and put them side by side, you can see that it really isn't all that much different. But because of those changes that GPT has made here, there are some significant things that we get out of that. So even though they are small changes, we're getting big dividends out of them. The first big thing here is obviously they have upgraded the SSD. So now we can have a 2280 NVMe stick that can be put into the GPD Win Mini. 2280 sticks are a lot more plentiful, and just value-wise, we find them to be a lot better as they are more standard size for what we find on the market. So going to 2280 is a size stick that is going to be the best bang for the buck for the general consumer. So this is a good move to go to the 2280 as opposed to sticking to 2230. They've added an independent amplifier integrated circuit to boost the sound quality. Now, one thing that I do find to be a bit of a negative, because they've removed the front-firing speakers and they are now down-firing. I really prefer front-firing speakers. Even though the sound quality of this is amazing, I still prefer it to be front firing, but I know that there are changes that needed to be made for a reason. So I am fine with everything that they've done, because as you'll find out later in this video, there are some very worthwhile changes. Another small change they've made, but has a big impact for me, is they moved the mouse emulation controller switch to the left-hand side of the device. This makes it far more intuitive to just quickly switch between the two without having to think at all. Previously, on previous GPD Win models, it was on the back of the device, and I would always find myself having to peck for it whenever I wanted to switch to it. And now it's just easily on the left-hand side. There is also a new controller grip that they have, especially for those of you that like better ergonomics for these types of handhelds. When you do put it on, it actually does obfuscate where that switch is. So just make sure that you put it in controller mode before putting this on. However, with this new method, it is a single piece. So it's no longer a kind of always on or always off as it was before, because you gotta like screw it in. This one just has clips, so you just kind of unclip it, and it is rather rigid in there. There we go. So you can see that single piece right there. So that is one of the other new things, but arguably, with all of the changes that they've made, the small considerations to making it just a little bit larger, is the vastly improved cooling to not only the internals of the device, but the externals of the device as well. And I'm going to show you clear examples where you're going to see night and day differences between running these devices. I have 10 watt and 17 watt. And while this device can go up to 28 watt and 35 watt because of the new internal cooling, and I'll show you all of that, I don't recommend running at 28 watt, which is the default that this comes at. When you get this, this is going to run at 28 watt, which I feel is just way too high. And the reason it's way too high, especially when we get to the battery life, is that if you're playing a game at 28 watt and it's going to run at load like that, you're going to expect around an hour of battery life. It only has a 45 watt hour, 44 watt hour battery in here. So don't expect the world. It's still 10% larger than the original Steam Deck LCD battery. And it's now 10% less than the battery, a little bit more, 12% less than the battery in the Steam Deck OLED. So it's still a sizable battery in this tiny little device, but it's still not a gigantic battery, and it can take a lot of power if you give it. So I just would kind of push back on that, and that's something you're going to hear me say a lot. 17 watt, 18 watt is really the max of where I would say you should run this device. Especially at 17, 18 watt, you're going to get like 95%, 90% of the available performance that you're going to get out of this device anyway. So pushing more power, you're going to be spending 50% more power for another 10%, 15%, really isn't all that worthwhile. But that's all I really wanted to kind of address here. Let's get into what makes the new 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini. First up, let's talk about the specs of the device. So now there are a few different options that you can choose from in terms of the processor that you can look for in the 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini. There is the Ryzen AI9 HX370 or the HX365. There is also the availability of using the AMD 8840U, the older generation Hawk Point. And when we get into some of the benchmarks in here, you can see that there's going to be some considerations for using the 8840U. However, it may be that the 8840U will only be a 16 gigabyte option from GPD. And I would really recommend going up to around 32 gigabytes of RAM. So if you find yourself waffling around price around there, I would probably advise going to 32 gigs of RAM because that is really going to save you a lot of headache, especially being able to put VRAM up to 8 gigabytes easily, and then having 24 gigabytes of system RAM. When you're down to 16 gig, especially with newer games, you're going to start having a lot of contention with VRAM. If you do choose to go 16 gigabytes, it's not a terrible decision. Just put VRAM at around 3 gigabytes, and that is a solid amount, and then let everything else get sorted as it would in the operating system. We have the same backlit keyboard that they found on the previous GPD Win Minis, and for all intents and purposes, it looks to be the same exact size. I get around 45 word per minute on this device. I type with all my thumbs. I type on it like I would as a BlackBerry. Trying to use your four fingers is not something that I would particularly recommend. It is a thumb-typeable keyboard only. There is a bit of a stretch with how wide the device is, and that's just part and parcel with everything. But I still love that there is a full keyboard and touchpad on this device at all times. This allows you to make sure that at any given time, you can have the controller and the keyboard and mouse completely available to you at all times, which makes it, you can treat it like a traditional PC and not have any particular problems where if you only had a controller and a touchscreen on the device itself. They note here that new cooling module and fan, this is big. This is a big part of the 2025 edition of the GPD Mini. Don't count this out. This is a huge feature. And we'll get in more into this. Take a look at the chapter links below for thermal tests as well as stress testing on TDP so you can get a better idea of what's going on there. Obviously, I've already showed you the grip that we talked about previously. This is a one-piece solution, nothing that you have to kind of graft on. It kind of just snaps into place by 4 different pivot points. Once you connect those, it snaps in and it's very secure. This is more for people that really care about full ergonomics. That's not something that I particularly care about. I care about something that is far more convenient insofar as being able to just quickly take it with me and like put it into my jacket pocket and then take out. So as a UMPC specifically, and also a gaming handheld, I care about being able to take it with me more than ergonomics. And I don't really find that the ergonomics of the device are bad as they are just regularly, but we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Next up is the 7-inch LTPS native landscape. This is huge. This is effectively the same screen that is in the Ally and the Ally X. Having a native landscape screen on a Windows gaming PC is critical. I cannot abide by having a native portrait anymore for Windows devices. If you're going to go SteamOS, it doesn't matter at all because SteamOS has GameScope and that compositor will solve all of your problems. Whereas on Windows, having native portrait, you're going to have random problems, especially in newer games that'll happen. So having native landscape, VRR 120 hertz, very low power as well. It is an excellent display on the Ally and LAX, and we find it to be the same on the GPD Win Mini. Just an absolute great panel to have. One thing that is huge on this that I absolutely love that GPD has done, on the analog sticks, they are hole-based analog sticks. One of the things that you're going to always find on hole-based analog sticks is that there will be this call to perfect circularity in this one particular test. And when we do it, we can see that we're not getting a perfect circularity. In fact, we get along all of the diagonals, it actually bumps out a little bit and there's a little bit of extra range on the diagonals, even though at its direct cardinals, it is at the perfect edge of the range. This is the best implementation of a hole-based analog stick that I found to date. Typically, all of them want to have that perfect circularity, which you're going to find some games that when you're going to a specific diagonal, a character may not run. This happens more often in like PSP emulation. And even in the PSP emulator, there's an option to extend the range. So with this, you don't even need to use that option anymore, and it will make sure that you don't really have any problems. Really is a fantastic analog stick. And I know that a lot of people voice their concerns about not having a bunch of travel on the analog sticks themselves. But for me, to be honest, I don't have an issue with it whatsoever. I've played multiple games and yes, I wish it did have more travel, but there is going to be a compromise that you're going to have when, especially when the analog sticks are going to be recessed into a device because it's going to be clamshell, there are going to be compromises there. Can there be a better analog stick? 100% there are better analog sticks. If you had more range and more tension, 100%. What they have in here is a very good compromise, especially with how they've designed their hole-based analog sticks. I would like GPD to keep on pushing that further and see if they can find better analog sticks within that depth and still having more travel. But for what they have, it's not too bad. I think the only thing that I wish that GPD would do for the analog sticks is a concave topper instead of the convex that they have, because I'm not a fan of convex toppers. But that's something that is a preference of mine. I think it'll go a long way to making a lot of people feel like it had more swing, but that's a side thing at this point. And one other analog thing that is on this device are the rumble motors themselves. So the rumble motors are effectively two little vibrators, little vibration motors that are affixed to the bottom of the case and kind of vibrate outward to onto where your hands are holding the device. It kind of resonates throughout the entire device, so you can't really feel the presence of where those vibrations are coming from, but they are felt even at a very, very low frequency. When talk about analog, they are very analog like. When you have a little bit of rumble, they'll have a little bit of vibration. So there's a big range to those vibration motors for the rumble effect on the controller aspect of the handheld itself. It's not a fantastic rumble, but it's good enough. Talking about the new cooling. Now, this is huge. This part is real huge. Now, this is something I had the first GPD Win Mini that was metal based, and that one got alarmingly hot, even at low TDPs, like alarmingly hot. Then when they went to the plastic fiber mix, that was an improvement. And still, people find that to be too hot, especially at 15 watt. I agree with them at 15 watt. Even back in my old review when I said that they fixed it, 13 watt was really the max that I wanted to go to. But when we compare them even at 17 watt running and we put them side by side under the same thermal scanner, you can see how big of a difference the previous plastic fiber mix versus the new cooling solution that is on the 2025 edition of the GPU Win Mini. This is at 17 watt, and it is self-evident how much better it is. So that is a clear win for the 2025 edition of the GPU Win Mini. That is, I think, going to be the bigger selling point for most everyone for the GPD Win Mini. Along those same lines, when we talk about the improved cooling solution, I went ahead and tried to do a TDP stress test. So I started off at 45 watt, and almost immediately that didn't go well. So it went up to 45 watt for about 5 seconds and then hit its ceiling of temperature and then automatically started dialing that down to about 38 watt TDP. And then I was looking at it and I was already at 95C and I was like, you know what, let me cut this back down to 35 watt. So in the graph that you're looking at, you can see that we have a nice solid 35 watt TDP. And for a long time, it just stayed at 95 degrees Celsius. So it was there for a long, long time. And I was like, that's pretty hot. So even though it can support 35 watt TDP and you're going to be around 95 degrees Celsius there almost all the time, that is at the upper end of what is a defined standard for the chip. It actually can run at 95 degrees Celsius all the time. I don't particularly like running that hot. So if we jump it down to about 30 watt, temps go down to about 85 degrees Celsius. So general use, I would say 30 watt is a solid wattage to run this at all the time. For what it's worth, the default TDP that the device runs at is 28 watt. However, when we start talking about like how that works in battery life, which we're going to get to in a second, I do want to just kind of quickly compare the GPD Win Mini to, like, say, the Ally X. When we put both of these systems at 17 watt, we're still getting better performance on the GPD Win Mini, especially the HX3070 versus the Z1E that finds itself in the Ally X. Even though we have better performance inside 17 watt and 17 watt inside of Indiana Jones, right? When we're taking a look at Indiana Jones, the one thing that you should find that's pretty critical is that the Ally X uses around 2 to 3 watts less total system power, even though both of them are running at 17 watt TDP. So that's something that how Asus kind of engineered the Ally X, and it does a really good job across the board using as little power as possible, even within those defined TDP limits. So uh, even though we have better performance, it is still using a little bit less power. So keep that in mind, especially when we take a look at the Ally X versus the Win Mini and Returnal. It's pretty much the same. The GPU Win Mini still is winning, but again, we're still using around 2 3 watts more in total system power at 17 watts. So when we take a look at it from that perspective, even at 17 watts, you're going to be somewhere in the realm of 2 hours of battery life. So keep that in mind when you're pushing 17 watt all the time, is really going to limit how much battery life you have on this device. And even, when you look at the Steam Deck, when that was pushed at 15 watt, that had around 90 minutes of battery life as well. So for a lot of people, maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours is fine. I find that 2 hours to be the absolute bare minimum of acceptable, really. So when we take a look at battery life, right? If we were to just gun the system at its default 28 watt, you're going to basically get 1 hour of battery life. And when we find it running, you can see it start off at 28 watt, and then it'll just kind of jot itself down to 24 watt, and it'll just keep chewing through power all the time. So just be mindful of that. But the device can go all the way down to 3 watts. So if you're running indie games and other stuff, just use the included software called Motion Assistant to go ahead and tune TDP all the way down, especially for older emulators and indie games. And if you run the system at 3 watt, you're going to get over 7 hours of battery life. So you have a large range of battery life that you can get out of this device. So there is a large area of battery life that you is possible to get out of this device, but it's going to be on you to kind of control that and manage that a little bit. Like, don't just set a high TDP and expect the system to take care of it. It's not. Now, there is the floating GPU method in the motion assistant software, and that will try to hit an FPS cap while trying to lower the GPU clock down automatically, and that is something that I do recommend. And the first game that we're going to be comparing AMD's older 6800U versus AMD's latest Strix Point HX 3070. Now, remember, we're talking about a lot of improvements out of here, not just on the GPU side, but pretty much everywhere. We have a gigantic node improvement, gigantic CPU improvement. Remember, we were Zen 3 Plus, and now we're at Zen 5 and Zen 5C. We have RDNA 3.5, which does have some memory improvements, and all of the memory controller improvements that have happened from 6800U all the way up to Strix Point. So there's around 4 different sets of improvements that we look at compared to everything here. So let's go ahead and see how this scales at different wattages. When we take a look at 10 watt, we can see that the 6800U compared to the HX 3070 is about 42% better on averages and around 43% better on 1 percentile. Bumping up to 15 watt, now remember, you have to look at this first dark gray one because that's a 15 watt HX 3070. We're looking at 36% better on averages, and we're looking around 42% better on 1 percentile. If we go up to 20 watt, compared to 20 watt, it's 50% better on averages and 52% better on 1 percentile. These are really good results. So if you are the type of person that we're still holding on to 6800U and we're wondering if it's a good enough improvement, it is a sizable improvement pretty much everywhere, but it's not yet quite generational. It's not closer to a 2x or closer to a 30 to 50% boost as opposed to a 70 to 2x percent boost. So keep that in mind when we're looking at this. So just have an idea of where we are and where we've been. Continuing right along with our comparison with 6800U versus AMD Strix Point, again, having all those node advantages, the CPU advantages, as well as the slight GPU advantages and all those memory controller improvements. We're taking a look at 10 watt. We have a 61% performance improvement on 10 watt on averages. When we take a look at 1 percentile, it's a 208% increase, basically 2x, which is really, really good. When we go to 15 watt, now again, take a look at the one that the darker gray bar above, we can see that we're about 40% better on averages. And if we go to 1 percentile, we're 77% better. It's really, really good. At 20 watt, we're looking at 46% better on averages and 65% better on 1 percentile. So if you were looking at something like, you had an older 6800U and you said, what type of performance gains do we get out of here? This is not quite generational, but we're almost there. We're almost at a point where when we take a look at when RDNA 2 and 1600U first came out, that we're almost at a point where this is now a sizable enough leap where things start to look a lot better. And the third game to compare AMD's 6800U versus AMD Strix Point HX 3070, we're taking a look at Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I am using DirectX 10, DirectX 11 backend with ultra settings. This, again, I talk about this all the time, but this is a very DirectX 11 hard game. It doesn't have any resolution scaling options whatsoever. It's really the tail end of like what we saw from a lot of traditional DirectX 11 games before we started getting into resolution scaling and just before Vulkan and DX12 started becoming the norm. So this is a game that is quite hard to run because it requires a lot of CPU and GPU to be working in tandem to get anything done. When we take a look at our 10 watt results, we can see that HX 3070 is about 26% better on averages, around 23% better on 1 percentile. Going up to 15 watt, we can see that HX 370 is only 16% better on averages and only 17% better on 1 percentile. And when we go up to 20 watt, we can see that on averages, we're about 24% better on averages and around 23% better on 1 percentile. So this is a game that I think really does highlight a lot that we're only getting very, very minute positives here. We're going to really have to tune up HX 3070 a whole bunch to really extract a bunch more from the 60 from the difference, the performance difference between 6800U and the HX 3070. But just at defaults, right? Like we're running out the defaults. This is where we're looking at between these two platforms, and it's not a gigantic increase. So when we take a look at that, like on the low end of the scale, at being around 30% better over the 6800U. Yes, it's better, but it doesn't quite feel like it's not generational, right? So we're hoping beyond hope that RDNA 4 gets us there, but who knows at this point? We might be behind, potentially a few years, or if something comes along with just more memory bandwidth. But that's what we're looking at comparing the two. Still better, but not quite the leap that I think a lot of people think it should be. This game is Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm running at 720p with the favorite performance preset. Again, we're taking a look at 6800U versus the HX 3070. And again, when we take a look at 10 watt here versus both of those platforms, 6800U and HX 3070, we can see we're around 29% better on averages and 27% better on 1 percentile. Pushing up to 15 watt, we can see our averages are around only 13% better on averages and around 11% on 1 percentile. Again, going up to 20 watt here, we're taking a look at around 18% better on averages and around 14% better on 1 percentile. This is 6800U versus HX 3070. Now, the interesting thing here is that this one game is something that I often highlight when I compare it, especially to Intel platforms, because it's such an AMD optimized game. So when we take a look at games that are heavily optimized, we can see that RDNA 2 and RDNA 3.5, there really isn't a giant difference, especially when we're so memory bound together. The only benefits that we're really getting is going to be whatever CPU improvements we can get. But again, we get a little bit of a loss here with Windows 24H2 and the heterogeneous cores as they are right now, versus whatever we're getting with regard to having a much bigger GPU and higher frequencies, right? We should be able to start pushing towards that, especially at 20 watt. We do get benefits at the lower side, but ultimately here, we're not getting enough. And with this AMD optimized title, it's pretty interesting to see that the difference between 6800U and the best HX 3070 is what, 15-20%? That's nothing to write home about, really. And the last game that we're going to be comparing the 6800U to AMD's HX 3070 is going to be Returnal. I'm running at 720p with low settings. However, I am using FSR2 balance, so I am running at a sub-resolution at 720p and upscaling to that. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here is that on the HX 3070, this has a capability of, because we have such a wide GPU, we have 16 CUs, what we can do is we can go wide and slow, which is superior than going with a less wide and high frequency. That voltage spike is going to hit us and it's going to extract more power from us. Going wide and slow is superior. And because Returnal is such a GPU-bound game, this is one area where you're going to see maximum results. So let's take a look at 10 watt. Now, we can see that even 15 watt is just catching up to 10 watt HX 3070. So when we take a look at 10 watt 6800U versus 10 watt HX 3070, it's 78% better on averages and 80% better on 1 percentile, which is fantastic. When we go up to 15 watt, we can see that we're looking at 64% better on averages. Remember, we're up here for 15 watt for HX 3070. So we're 64% better on averages and 48%, 49% better on 1 percentile. Solid. When we go up to 20 watt, we have 62% better on averages and 61% better on 1 percentile. That is approaching next generation type of performance, right? Next generation to me is basically 70%. When we hit 70%, that's when it feels like a next generation part. When we're kind of just hovering there. But remember, this is at a max end. So at a max end where a game is really highlighting the benefits of the system, this is not a clear win for HX 3070. Even though there are going to be a lot of games that, especially as they're coming out, are going to be more and more GPU focused, there are going to be areas where the HX 3070 is fantastic. And even though in this particular instance, it's just dominating over the 6800U, I could, with all the other games that we've taken a look at, if you have a 6800U, if you're asking yourself, should you upgrade? It's not like a very clear-cut answer. So it really is up to you, where you're only going to be getting, in some different games, you're only going to be getting maybe 15 to 20% better performance at the same wattage. And then in some instances, you're going to be getting 50% better on averages and stuff. And then on this particular game right here, right, like we're seeing at 10 watt, we're seeing almost 80% better on averages, which is a generational leap. But this is Returnal, a very GPU-bound game, so you're going to need to find other very GPU-bound games that would have to compete with the 6800U. So it's going to be few and far between, is basically what I'm saying. But still pretty awesome. Still pretty awesome results. That's going to be it for looking at the differences between 6800U and the HX 3070. We're going to be following up with this and taking a look at the differences between the 8840U and the HX 3070. In this series of benchmarks, we're going to be comparing AMD's last generation Hawk Point, specifically their old flagship, the 8840U. We're going to be comparing it to their newer flagship, which is AMD Strix Point, which is the HX 3070 model. Now, to be fair, I'm using the 2024 edition of the GPD Win Mini that I had previously. The 2025 edition, there is an 8840 version as well. You can get either or. Through these benchmarks, it's going to look like there's not a giant difference. Now, the one reason that I am currently omitting any type of tweaks or anything out of this is because when I do, a lot of people sometimes get mad because they think it's like trickery that I do to make the numbers better, but I'm just tuning the system up. So if we just compare them as they are, which is what a lot of people are like you are going to have, right? If it's just the default to default, we're not going to see a large difference, even though we can park cores on Strix Point and get better results. I'm going to do that for a later video that won't be for this particular review. So just have that in mind when we go through these, when we start looking at them. At the very baseline, we can see that Hawkpoint is actually winning. Now, the one thing that we also have to talk about is Cyberpunk is a very weird game because it's very closely aligned with how Windows Scheduler does things, and we do find it getting better once we park cores, like I had said earlier. But more to the point, we should see a better result here because Bakelite, even with all cores active, gets better results than this. So it's really a quagmire of like a lot of different issues, specifically 24H2 and how Windows is doing things on the schedule side of things with the heterogeneous cores on the new Strix Point, where we have 4 P cores and 8 E cores. So keep that in mind as well, that there's a lot of stuff going on in flight, and maybe Windows kernel gets updated where scheduler is better for Intel and AMD in the future. Regardless, that's a bunch of information, but let's just take a look at what we have right now, looking at default types of benchmarks against these. We see that the 8840U is actually pulling ahead, but for the most part, they're pretty similar. On 1 percentile, we do have about 10% better. Largely at 10 watt, neither one of these are playable, so it doesn't matter all that much. However, when we go up to 15 watt, again, 8840U takes a sizable lead here, and we're looking around 15% better on averages, around 10% better on 1 percentile. So not super huge, but still that's a large difference between the two, and you would have roughly the same experience. I think you have the 8040U, especially with that 1 percentile being at a solid 30 FPS, that you have a more streamlined experience. Obviously, you can also use FSR. With such low frame rate, I don't recommend FSR 3. Going from 30 to 60 isn't the best experience, but that's obviously to taste, and if you're fine with it, then by all means. When we go to 20 watt, which is really where we should look at the tail end of TDPs for this particular handheld, because we only have a 45 watt hour battery. While we can go up to 28 watt and get like another 10-15%, the battery life is going to go down to basically an hour, which I don't think is very worthwhile. You can do that and you can plug in, and I know a lot of people argue for that, but I'm going to argue for battery life here. So we take a look at our top end. We can still see that 8840U is winning, around 5% better on averages, around 4% better on 1 percentile. Effectively, what you're seeing here is kind of a wash, and we can still do much better when we tune stuff up, or if we just go to Bakelite. Both of those will be in a video that I do later, so just keep that in mind as we go forward with the types of benchmarks that we're going to be doing. Let's go to the next game. Once again, comparing the AMD 8840U compared to the HX 3070, we're taking a look at Deus Ex Mankind Divided with DirectX 11 and Ultra settings. This is a very DirectX 11 hard game, like I had just previously said in the previous set of benchmarks for the 6800U. We take a look at 10 watt. We can see that the 8840U is on the bottom, and we have HX 3070 is about 5% better. For 1 percentile, it's only 2% better. We can still bowl ahead, and I'm probably the broken record at this point by just doing core parking. But again, at defaults, we're getting slightly better. And the reason that we're doing there is it's kind of a give and take, right? We're kind of wasting power on the CPU side, but we're pulling ahead on the GPU side. And you would think that that doesn't make much sense. But when we have wider cores going wider and slower, is a benefit because the voltage will be lower, meaning we spend less power. And so that's all it is. It's just a power management thing. And when we have more GPU cores, we can go to a lower clock to extract more performance. Ultimately, we're still memory bound, which we can see that when we start pushing more power into it at 15 watt, we can see the 8840U actually pulls ahead by a bit. We're around 9% better on averages and 9% better on 1 percentile. Again, it flips over at 20 watt, where the HX 3070 is around 3% better on averages, so takes a small hit around 3% on 1 percentile. So kind of a give and take here. It's not gigantically different, but the difference between the 8840U and HX 3070 with default settings, you're not really going to see much of a clear win here. Without either tuning or heading over to Bazzite and Linux scheduler, kind of makes things a little bit better there. So that's it for Deus Ex Mankind Divided. And for the next game, comparing the 8840U to AMD's Strix Point, it's going to be Horizon Zero Dawn. We're running 720p with the favorite performance preset. And when we take a look at these, again, 24H2 and the full allotment with just default settings and not trying to tune up HX 3070 all that much, what we're seeing is that AMD's 8840U is going to be able to pull ahead in some ways. So at 10 watt, when we take a look, we can see that the 8840U is at the bottom, but effectively we're only about 2% better on averages and effectively the same on 1 percentile. When we bump it up to 15 watt, this is where 8840U kind of pulls ahead. And we're around 13% better on averages and around 10% better on 1 percentile. So just keep that in mind that when we just bumped it up to 15 watt there, that we got a pretty sizable lead. Now, I don't want to suggest that HX 3070 is not as good as 8840U. We do have to tune it up. We have to do stuff. If we just 8840U is a monolithic single Zen 4. There is no type of heterogeneous. There's no 4 Zen full fat Zen Zen 5 cores and then 8 Zen 5C cores. So there's not this like differentiation that is going on that the OS needs to handle. So again, I'm a broken record at this point. I've been saying the same thing over and over again. But if we go to the 20 watt, we can see that AMD's 8840U does pull ahead around 5%, and on 1 percentiles, it does pull ahead about 9%. Ultimately, what this means is even though we could potentially do better on HX 3070, there isn't really much of a point, especially at these lower wattages, and you don't really want to push for higher wattages, and we're not going to get that much better because we can push 8840U higher as well. This is just a situation where we're really starting to see the memory bandwidth being a giant problem for us in gaming. So if you wanted to really just maximize the battery life on the GPD Win Mini and get the best bang for the buck, it's looking really like 8840U is going to be taking the cake there. But we still have one more game to take a look at to compare them, so let's get into it. And the last game that we're going to be looking at, comparing the difference between the 8840U versus the HX 3070, this game is Returnal. I'm running at 720p with low settings, but I am using FSR2 balance, so it is a sub-resolution of 720p, and then we're upscaling to that. Now, Returnal is a game that I always love including. It is a sensationally GPU-bound game. As such, we will be able to extract the most amount of performance at any given wattage, but specifically at lower TDPs, they should be highlighted as well because going low and slow is preferable. So when we take a look at our 10 watt results, we can see that we're around 18% better on averages and around 14% better on 1 percentile. These are respectable gains considering that the 8840U is their last generation part. So we're still getting a nice 15-20% bump here at 10 watt. That's actually really good results. When we go up to 15 watt, then 8840U can start catching up because we have a bit of a better play here. We're only looking at 3% better on averages, and it actually takes a little bit of a hit on 1 percentile. We're about 5% worse on 1 percentile in the HX 3070. When we push it up to 20 watt, we're only around 10% better on averages. However, our 1 percentile looks pretty good with also a 10% bump on 1 percentile as well. So the good news there is at 20 watt for the HX 3070, that is a solid amount of wattage, even at 18 watt as well, where we can have a very comfortable play experience. So that's not something that was really possible on the Steam Deck or anything else really, but at 20 watt, you're pretty much going to even have at a worst case scenario, because this what we're looking at here is pretty much a worst case scenario of what we're looking at. At 20 watt, you'll be able to go down to 30 watts, but you'll actually be going up to like 60 and 70 FPS in other zones. So just keep that in mind that this frame rate, this FPS that you're looking at is typically a worst case scenario. So that's really the look at the difference between the 8840U and the HX 3070. largely it doesn't look like it's a solid win if we were just to compare these by default, which a lot of you are going to do. When you get this device, you're just going to start playing. And if you just start playing with the default settings between the two, there's not a giant difference between them. So keep that in mind when you're taking a look at the 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini. There are a lot of improvements on the GPD Win Mini, and specifically the thermals of them are a gigantic improvement. I'm a big fan of it. I feel like this current iteration of the GPD Win Mini is a fantastic set to go forward and move forward on and iterate forward on. But that's going to be the end of where we're taking a look at the benchmarks to give you a better idea, comparing the 6800U, which we did in the previous set, versus the HX3070 in this set. I hope that was informative. Let's get on with the rest of this review. So, can I recommend the 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini? The answer is yes, absolutely I can. The thermal solution that GPD has done here and the expansion of how much wider they made it and the thickness have gone a long way to making not only the internal temperatures, but the external temperatures much, much better on this device. It used to be even in my previous review, I said that 13 watt was the max that I would run at the device. And that was something that it felt like I wanted to at least hit 15 watt, because at 13 watt, it was kind of a compromise, but also I wanted to extend battery life. So it was kind of okay in there. Now we find ourselves being able to run this device at 17 watt comfortably. You can push it more and still not feel the heat as much, but I really wouldn't recommend it. Having 17 watt and 18 watt as the max that you push this device to is something that I would really stress as a general handheld playing. Now, it's up to you to run it to taste however you want. So this is really just a recommendation for me. It's just that there's diminishing returns past 18 watt, that if you go up to 28 watt from 18 watt, it's only about a 10% performance gain, even though you're spending 50% more power. So is that a worthwhile trade? To me, it isn't. If you are okay with it, then just be prepared for around 60 minutes of battery life if you're going to be running at 28 watt TDP. That is not something I generally recommend. At 17 watt TDP, you're going to get around 2 hours of battery life, which still is just barely the bare minimum of what I really feel is acceptable for PC gaming handhelds today. So that is a number that I would like to be higher as well. But it is what it is, and you can also just lower down the TDP, right? So even playing older games or indie games or older PC games, you don't have to drill it at 17 watt all the time. You can dial that down. The included motion assistant app is very easy to use. There's also the floating GPU option, which will try to hit an FPS cap and try to auto balance the TDP at that FPS cap, and it works really well. So that's another solution that you can try. It's included in all of the GPD Win Mini stuff. I really love this device. If you're looking for the smallest, most powerful gaming handheld gaming PC on the market, this is your answer. The 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini is what you should be looking for. The only things that I wish that GPD had on this was Oculink. I really wish that they put Oculink on it, because GPD pushes the envelope on hardware always. They are a very hardware-based company. Look at the hole-based analog sticks on here. There is no other company but GPD that is giving us a little bit of extra range on the diagonals. That is a small but tasteful decision that they have made to make sure that games always play perfectly. And that's a hardware-based decision, and GPD does well there. So not having Oculink, I feel like, is a net negative. Especially as time goes on, the next generation of parts being MCIO Mini Cool Edge, which when we're going to PCIe Gen 5, is something that I really wish GPD explores, especially if we want to explore the PCIe 5, especially for eGPUs, and getting the most value out of those. So that's something that I really wish GPD would do. The only other thing that I wish GPD would do is try to source other analog sticks. I prefer the concave analog sticks, and this is something I've been saying forever now. But much like the ones that I find in the AYN Odin 2, those analog sticks with the concave stick toppers, my absolute preference. I also think that they might have a bit more range, but I would love GPD to explore and try to find a way to get these analog sticks, even though they're not very deep at all, and there are challenges working in here, I would like them to explore and try to push the limit and make the best analog sticks possible. Having said that, what is on here is already acceptable and very good. If you are looking for the smallest, most pocketable, best PC gaming handheld, look no further and accept no substitutes other than the 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini. Thank you very much to my Patreon members as well as my YouTube channel members. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.